The summer of 1942 burned like fire across North Africa. The desert sun reflected off endless sand dunes, and the roar of German panzers echoed across valleys, a terrifying symphony of steel and destruction. British tanks armed with outdated two-pounders and underpowered cruisers faced annihilation with every skirmish. Commanders knew that without heavier guns, the next engagement could shatter entire regiments. But amid this desperation, one mad mechanic, a man dismissed as reckless by superiors, would quietly forge a temporary edge that changed the course of battle for Britain's armored units. He worked not in labs or offices, but in the blistering heat of field depots, surrounded by smoke, sparks, and the acrid tang of burned gunpowder. What he built would not last forever, yet for a brief, shining moment, it gave the British a fighting chance against a seemingly unstoppable force. He was a mechanic named Thomas Tom Wilkes, unremarkable to most at first glance. A stocky man with oil-streaked hands, a face lined with sand and fatigue, and eyes that flickered with restless ideas assigned to a remote repair depot on the outskirts of Tobruk. He spent his days amidst the chaos of battlefield salvage, twisted hulls, scorched turrets, and the haunting echo of distant artillery fire. Every morning he climbed onto damaged tank turrets, listening to the complaints of old engines and rattling gearboxes, imagining not just repairs but transformations. Wilkes knew the official blueprints, the standard procedures, the strict chain of command, but he ignored them. While officers debated logistics, he sketched, filed, and modified, driven by a simple burning question. How do we make these cannons hit the Panther or the Panzer IV before our men die? The depot smelled of hot metal and oil. The air was thick with dust and the acrid stench of spent shells. Wilkes' hands were blistered from hammering and reshaping recoil systems, his clothes stained with grease and sweat. Yet in that heat and grime, a spark of genius flickered. He experimented with propellant charges, altered breach tolerances, and tested firing mechanisms under the watchful eye of the unforgiving desert sun. Each small success felt miraculous. Each failure burned him inside. Yet he pressed on, haunted by the thought that every delay meant another comrade lost to German armor. By midday, Wilkes had created improvised gunnery rigs, field-modified weapons capable of punching holes into tanks previously deemed invulnerable. He knew the risk. A single miscalculation could blow the gun apart, endangering his own team. He measured powder charges by hand, tweaked barrel alignments with crude jigs, and recorded every iteration in a battered notebook. With pages curling under the desert heat, soldiers passing through the depot would stop, eyes wide, to watch him work. Some whispered that he was reckless. Others began to whisper legend. He worked silently, rarely explaining, often ignoring orders to stick strictly to regulation. Each test shot sent clouds of smoke and sand into the sky, the booming recoil rattling windows and shaking nearby supply crates. But with every explosion, he learned something new. How steel flexed, how the gun breathed, how heat warped accuracy. The work was exhausting, dangerous, and lonely. Yet Wilkes carried the weight of hundreds of lives on his shoulders, fueled by a stubborn certainty that his hands could bend reality, that ingenuity could defy the deadliest machines the world had ever seen. Even as the nights grew colder, the desert still shimmered with heat trapped in sand and metal. Wilkes often slept fitfully beside a half-dismantled tank, notebook in hand, dreaming of armor piercing through German steel, imagining his comrades surviving ambushes that would have once meant certain death. He wrestled constantly with fear and doubt. Was his fix merely a temporary patch, a bandage on a wound too deep to heal? Could one man operating far from the front lines and without formal approval truly influence the outcome of entire battles? Each morning as dawnlight cut across the depot, he awoke to sand in his eyes and a new problem to solve. Guns misaligned from yesterday's tests, recoil mechanisms that refused to cooperate, and the ever-present clock ticking toward the next confrontation. And yet, every adjustment, every calculated risk, brought hope. For the first time, British tank crews could face German armor with more than courage. They had a fighting chance. Wilkes' temporary edge was fragile, improvised, and unheralded, but it existed, and for men who had nothing else, it was salvation. The first true test came sooner than anyone expected. Intelligence reports whispered of a German convoy advancing across the desert, a steel river of panzers and supply trucks cutting a path straight toward Wilkes' overstretched units. British tank crews scrambled to ready their aging cruisers, but morale was low. These old guns had no hope of piercing the enemy's armor. Wilkes, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights and hands caked with grease, arrived at the makeshift firing line carrying the field-modified guns. The officers, skeptical, called him reckless. "You'll blow the crews to pieces," they warned. He said nothing, only gave a tight nod and motioned to the gunners. The desert wind whipped sand across the faces of anxious soldiers, filling nostrils with grit. Wilkes felt it sting his eyes, a tiny reminder that war was never polite. Every muscle in his body ached, yet adrenaline made him feel alive, sharp, and unyielding. This was no longer theory. This was life and death. As the German tanks crested a ridge in the distance, their metallic silhouettes gleaming in the harsh sunlight, the first modified gun roared. A shockwave rattled the sand, the concussion deafening. A Panzer IV staggered, its steel hull screaming as a shell found its mark. Peeling armor like paper, Wilkes' heart jumped, a mix of exhilaration and fear. Could this fragile, improvised system hold under sustained fire? He glanced at his team, young men clutching the reins of these transformed weapons, faces pale but determined. They fired again, one after another, the rhythmic boom like the heartbeat of defiance. Smoke hung in the air, mixing with the tang of burned propellant. The German tanks faltered, forced to maneuver awkwardly under the unexpected punishment. Every successful hit sparked roars from British crews. Every miss a gasp of relief that the gun had not backfired Wilkes' modifications. Built with nothing but intuition, old parts and courage, were working. Against all reason, the odds had shifted. Hours passed like centuries. The sun moved lazily across the desert sky, baking steel and sand alike. Each engagement tested Wilkes' ingenuity further. Recoil systems groaned, ammunition jammed, barrels heated to dangerous red, yet he refused to stop. Sweat ran into his eyes, mixing with grease and desert dust. But he remained focused, calculating adjustments in real time. With a wrench in one hand and a shell in the other, he became a conductor of chaos, orchestrating an impromptu symphony of destruction. British crews, once cowed, now moved with newfound confidence, daring to flank German tanks and strike where older guns could not reach. Wilkes saw it all, the sparks of courage, the widening eyes of young soldiers realizing they could survive encounters that once meant death. It was exhilarating, terrifying, and fleetingly perfect. Every roar of the gun, every shattered tank hull, affirmed that his work, though improvised, was not madness. It was necessity, it was life. By late afternoon, the battle had turned into a dance of steel and sand. German forces, expecting little more than weak resistance, now hesitated, forced to adapt to the sudden lethality of British firepower. Wilkes, crouched behind a battered cruiser, wiped sweat from his brow and adjusted a misaligned barrel, knowing that each shot was a gamble. His temporary solutions, reinforced breech blocks, improvised recoil dampers, modified shell casings, had created an edge that was both miraculous and fragile. The desert rang with the cries of men, the shriek of metal under fire, and the crackling of burning vehicles. Wilkes' mind raced, calculating reload times, barrel tolerances, and angles of attack, as if the fate of every soldier depended on his ability to think faster than the enemy. And in many ways, it did. Every victory felt precarious, every success balanced on the edge of disaster. Yet he could not stop. He could not let fear dictate action when lives hung in the balance. As night fell, the desert became an expanse of shadows and flickering fires. The remaining German tanks withdrew, limping and scorched, and British crews began to gather their exhausted units. Wilkes, hunched over a field notebook, noted each success and failure, documenting lessons that might save lives tomorrow. No medal awaited him. No officer praised the improvised genius that had saved entire crews. Yet in that quiet, scorched night, he felt a profound satisfaction. He had taken what the army lacked: time, modern equipment, and standard approval, and forged it into something that could confront steel with steel. For a few precious hours, Britain's armored units had a fighting chance because one man refused to bow to convention. refused to wait for what might never come, and chose instead to act, to create, to challenge fate itself. The dawn after the first engagement brought no rest. Wilkes awoke to the acrid scent of spent powder, twisted metal, and the ever-present desert dust that clung to everything. His body ached from days without proper sleep, muscles stiff from wrenching, lifting, and enduring the recoil of improvised artillery. Yet his mind refused to relent. Reports from the field arrived in fragments, tank commanders describing near misses, crews noting unexpected successes. Each detail was a puzzle piece, revealing the strengths and weaknesses of his hasty designs. He studied them, scrawling diagrams on scrap paper, comparing barrel lengths, arms, recoil distances, and shell trajectories. The fight was not over. In fact, it had only begun. Every day brought new pressure. The Germans would adapt, as they always did, and the window of temporary superiority could close in a heartbeat. By mid-morning, the desert was alive with preparation. Wilkes moved between crews, his presence a strange mix of calm command and restless energy. Soldiers watched in awe as he disassembled a breech, fitted an improvised buffer, and reassembled it in minutes, seemingly bending the gun to his will. He could hear their thoughts, doubt, fear, admiration, envy. Each moment carried weight, the knowledge that one miscalculation could cost lives. Yet he also felt the thrill, the intimate connection between human ingenuity and raw survival, the sense that he was dancing on the edge of impossibility. Sparks flew as he welded reinforcements, the sound sharp against the low rumble of tanks warming up. The heat of the sun pressed down like a tangible force, sweat stinging his eyes as the smell of burning metal mingled with the desert wind. Every detail mattered. Every decision carried consequences, measured in seconds and inches. By late morning, a convoy of German armored cars was sighted on the horizon, testing the British lines. Wilkes' modifications were now battle-hardened, yet untested against sustained assault. He positioned his crews with precision, calculating angles of fire, distances, and optimal overlap. The first shot cracked the air, sending a shiver through the lines. A Panzerwagen shuddered under impact, its wheels buckling. The crews began to believe. The roar of improvised guns echoed across the sand, punctuated by explosions, metal shearing, and the occasional roar of tank engines. Wilkes ducked behind a berm, eyes scanning for damage, noting each reaction. His hands were black with grease, skin nicked and bleeding, but he worked relentlessly, tweaking sights, adjusting firing angles, and coaxing performance from machines not meant to fight at this level. Fear lingered in the air like a shadow, yet determination burned brighter. The battle intensified. German forces tried to outflank, probing weak points, testing the resilience of these field-altered weapons. Wilkes' mind raced through every scenario: overpressure, barrel warping, ammunition misfeeds. He moved like a conductor, signaling gunners, repositioning barrels, improvising shields from sandbags and scrap steel. Each moment demanded creativity under fire, and failure was a tangible, ever-present threat. Yet he refused to hesitate. The clamor of battle, the grinding of treads, the hiss of anti-tank rounds, the distant cries of men, was a language he understood intimately. Every jolt of the tank, every recoil of the gun, every puff of smoke told him a story about what needed improvement. His modifications, though crude, were now performing with uncanny efficiency, giving British crews the confidence to hold their lines longer than anyone expected. As afternoon turned to evening, Wilkes felt the strain of sustained engagement settle into his bones. The desert horizon glowed with fires from destroyed vehicles, smoke curling into the wind. Crews began to whisper stories of near miracles: the improvised breech that withstood repeated fire, the modified recoil that allowed rapid shots against superior armor. Wilkes knew these were temporary measures. Nothing he had built could withstand months of attrition or the arrival of more sophisticated enemy weapons. Yet for this day, for these crucial hours, his ingenuity had turned the tide. Soldiers looked to him not just as a mechanic, but as a lifeline, a symbol that resourcefulness and courage could bend reality to their favor. Wilkes allowed himself a brief, almost imperceptible smile, knowing that in war, sometimes survival depended not on orders from above, but on the audacity of one man to act when all else seemed hopeless. By nightfall, the desert was quiet again, save for distant patrols and the occasional crackle of fires. Wilkes documented each adjustment, each observation, each success and failure. The notebooks he filled would later inform standardized upgrades, but in that moment, they were a chronicle of human resolve. He felt the exhaustion pressing down, the heat leaving behind a lingering ache in every joint. Yet beneath it all, there was pride, a deep, resonant awareness that one individual, armed with determination and ingenuity, had carved a temporary edge in a battle where survival seemed improbable. The Germans had been forced to adapt. British crews had been emboldened, and the desert had witnessed the extraordinary effects of improvisation, courage, and relentless effort. Wilkes had created a lifeline, however fleeting, and the war had, for a moment, bent to the will of ingenuity. The following morning, the desert awoke under a pale, burning sun, the air shimmering with heat and the scent of spent powder. Wilkes moved among the battered tanks, his eyes sharp, scanning each barrel, each track, each crew member's exhausted expression. Overnight, reports had arrived of renewed German probes, faster, more coordinated, testing weaknesses the night had hidden. Every modification he had made now faced its ultimate trial. The pressure was suffocating, a relentless weight pressing on his shoulders. Each soldier depended on him, not as a commander, but as the unseen hand that could keep their lives intact. Wilkes felt it. The chill of responsibility mixed with the adrenaline surge that only came from standing on the knife edge of life and death. By mid-morning, the horizon shivered with movement. A column of German armor advanced, panzers cutting across the sand with mechanical precision. The British crews braced behind improvised berms in sandbag positions, eyes wide, hands steady on triggers, their faith in Wilkes' ingenuity palpable. Wilkes moved between tanks, adjusting sights, rechecking angles, tightening improvised braces that would absorb recoil, whispering encouragement as if the machines themselves could hear him. Sparks flew from welding, metal groaned under tension, and the roar of engines mingled with the wind, carrying the scent of oil and gunpowder. Fear, raw and immediate, hung like a heavy curtain over the battlefield. But Wilkes did not allow hesitation. Every calculation, every modification, every hurried adjustment mattered now more than ever. The first shots rang out with deafening intensity, cracking the air like the whip of fate itself. Tanks lurched, recoiling under fire, their modified gun biting into the advancing German columns with unexpected ferocity. Wilkes ducked behind a hull, his eyes fixed on the unfolding chaos, noting how each change he had forced into these machines performed under real stress. He felt the tremor in the steel beneath his hands, the subtle warping of barrels, the tiny shifts in recoil patterns that only someone who had built them by hand could interpret. Crews shouted, shells whistled, and explosions tore through the sand as the Germans were forced to scatter, adapt, or retreat. For a fleeting moment, the desert became a theater of ingenuity versus brute force, and Wilkes's temporary edge held strong against an enemy who had once seemed unstoppable. Hours passed in a blur of noise, smoke, and fire. Wilkes never paused, never lowered his guard. Each time a tank faltered, he was there, wrench in hand, welding, tightening, adjusting, turning near disasters into continued resistance. Soldiers began to whisper his name, as though invoking it might summon further miracles. He was exhausted, every muscle screaming, every nerve taut, yet adrenaline and purpose carried him forward. The improvised guns, born from desperation, now performed beyond what the original designs could achieve, holding lines, stopping advances, and, for this moment, changing the course of the battle. The desert trembled under the clash of armor and fire, a symphony of chaos, yet one orchestrated in small, critical notes by a single, mad mind. By late afternoon, the German advance had slowed, faltered, and finally begun to pull back. Wilkes stood amidst smoke, twisted steel, and sand, his hands blackened, skin scorched by heat and metal. Crews cheered softly, but he felt no triumph, only exhaustion, relief, and the quiet acknowledgement that what he had built was temporary. The battlefield, littered with destroyed vehicles and scorched sand, was a testament not just to firepower, but to human creativity and relentless courage. For a brief, brilliant moment, a single man's ingenuity had given Britain a fighting chance, reshaping the odds in a desperate war. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert, Wilkes understood something profound. That innovation born from necessity, courage in the face of impossibility, and the willingness to act without permission could turn even the direst situation into survival. Night fell over the desert like a heavy curtain. The battlefield transformed into a silent, shadowed expanse of twisted metal, scorched earth, and the lingering scent of gunpowder. The roar of engines and the thunder of artillery had faded, leaving only the hum of exhausted men and the whisper of wind across sand dunes scarred by war. Wilkes walked among the battered tanks, inspecting each one with a weary eye, tracing the scars of the day, dents, burn marks, improvised braces, and barrels that had endured far beyond their original design. Every mark told a story of fear, courage, desperation, and ingenuity. He felt the weight of it all, each life saved, each advance stalled, and each temporary miracle achieved by his mad interventions. Around him, soldiers murmured their gratitude, their eyes bright with admiration and relief. They knew he had risked everything, not just his safety, but his reputation and career, to give them the edge they desperately needed. Wilkes' mind replayed the day in relentless detail. The calculations under fire, the adjustments in the heat of battle, the moments when he had doubted whether his makeshift solutions would hold. Fear had been a constant companion, yet he had channeled it into action. The temporary guns he had built, initially scorned by higher command as reckless and unnecessary, had proven themselves decisive, turning British armor into a thorn in the side of the German advance. As the moon rose, casting silver light across the desert, Wilkes allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought of the nature of war and invention, of how necessity demanded boldness, and how ordinary men, when faced with impossible odds, could rise to extraordinary heights. He remembered the engineers back home, the rejected designs, the dismissed prototypes, and how every scrap of ingenuity he had scavenged and reshaped had now been tested in the crucible of combat. The battlefield was silent, yet it pulsed with the echoes of his choices, the lives they had saved, and the temporary edge he had carved out of chaos. Wilkes' work would not remain permanent. New guns and reinforcements would arrive, altering the balance once more. Yet the lesson endured. Courage combined with creativity could create miracles, even if only for a moment. In those fleeting hours, the impossible had been made real. The men he had served alongside would remember the day a mad field innovator, armed with nothing but determination and ingenuity, held the line and shaped the course of battle. And for Wilkes, that knowledge of making a difference when hope seemed all but lost was more lasting than any medal or commendation. In the quiet of that desert night, under a sky blanketed with stars, one truth crystallized. History is often changed not by generals or kings, but by ordinary individuals willing to defy expectation, embrace risk, and act when inaction would mean defeat. Wilkes had done just that. The mad field innovator had turned desperation into innovation, fear into courage, and temporary machines into instruments of survival. And in doing so, he had left a mark not just on the sands of the desert, but on the enduring legacy of human ingenuity, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, one determined mind can tip the scales, create hope, and alter the course of history.